I skipped above you, but thank you for rejoining the queue. H, how do you sound now? Let's hear it. That sounds great.
Is that good? Am I good?
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. All right,
And
I'll be watching in the
now because
background.
I've never been able to sing. So should I try it?
I would recommend not singing. We have 12 people here. We don't want them to leave. No, I'm kidding. All right, guys, enjoy your pitches. Enjoy chatting to H, and I'll be in the background watching. So have fun.
Thanks, Sean. Is it Kiana? Is that right?
Yes, it's Kiana.
Hey, Kiana, nice to meet you. Thanks for being patient while we fixed my audio.
No
nothing
worries.
worse than bad audio. So go for it. Jump right in.
Great. Okay, so I moved to LA in 2018 to pursue a career in entertainment. And as you probably know, the landscape is very competitive. I ended up having to get a job at a cannabis startup for a few months to support myself financially. I found myself working a lot of long nights, counting $20,000, sometimes $30,000 by hand. After a long day of deliveries. And it was really during those nights that I thought back to growing up in New Jersey, going to family gatherings and not knowing who some of my cousins or uncles were because they had been in jail behind marijuana charges. And even now that I'm working in entertainment, I was able to make it into the UTA mailroom. I worked at Amazon Studios for a little bit, now at Anonymous Content. Even now, I still think about how right next to entertainment, cannabis is one of the most lucrative industries in our state. Frankly, while many Black people still sit in prison because of it, that thinking inspired frustration, and that frustration inspired me to write my screenplay. So Greener is an action drama feature that can best be described as Little Woods meets Leave No Trace, told in the vein of 90s neo-noir. The log line is as follows. Given 3 days to save her family home from foreclosure, an aspiring architect turns to robbing a chain of marijuana dispensaries whose design was stolen from her. So the story begins with our protagonist, April, finding an eviction notice on her front door. After she makes a deal with the bank to come up with $50,000 in 3 days to avoid foreclosure, she stumbles upon a news profile of her old friend and classmate, Luke Scott. Luke is now the proud owner of a $1 billion luxury cannabis cafe company called Greener. April makes a quick trip to a local Greener and sees her own architectural design that she showed Luke years ago. With a newfound vendetta against Luke and extensive knowledge of each building's design, April plots to rob enough Greeners to save her home. She's joined by her cousin Lamont, who's reluctantly motivated to tag along, despite him still being on parole for possession of marijuana, actually from years ago. The closer April gets to reaching her monetary goal, the more she starts to realize, though, that the journey she took to save her family is now turning into one of self-discovery instead. By the end of the film, we're not only rooting for her to outsmart Luke and get the money, but also for her to figure out her own needs and wants outside of her family, and even furthermore outside of Luke. The major conflict that impedes April from her own self-realization is fear of the unknown. Although an outrageously dangerous mission, April goes into these robberies knowing that it's going to go either one of two ways. She has a family member that's been incarcerated after all. What becomes the more prominent conflict or fear for April is what she makes of her life after these 3 days. So that's all I have. I'll hand it over to you for feedback. Thank you.
Awesome. That was great. I love that, Kiana. I think, what the way I would describe this actually is you're writing like a great caper movie that's actually exploring serious social issues, right? And has a social message. And so like it makes me think of like what Jordan Peele does with horror film, right? Like it's a great horror movie, but it's also really talking about something that is a pretty serious set of social issues, right? And so I think that's an interesting way to maybe think about and frame your pitch. I think the sort of backstory you give us at the beginning is great. It's a great way in to say, hey, this story comes from an experience I had in thinking about it this way. I might shorten it a little bit just so that you get into the story faster, or even lead with a log line and then go into your journey and kind of how you got to it, right? Just so that you grab people's attention. You set up the expectation of what the film is, right? And I think the other thing is you did an interesting thing where after you talked about your backstory, you said, the log line is as follows, right? And you probably want to try and not use expositional transitions like that, right? Like find a way to get into the story organically, right? To just sort of like shift into it through the storytelling. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Rather than kind of signposting that, right? And I think the other thing I would say is you did the very classic thing. Several of you guys have done it today, of doing the sort of, this story is this meets this, right? Earlier we had Drive meets something, and you did it's this meets this. I think that that's a great device as long as the people you're pitching really know those stories. And I lost Kiana, but I'm going to just continue for a minute. It's a great device when people really know the stories, the films or TV shows or whatever it is that you're referencing, but sometimes they don't know it. And that's where you might lose somebody in a pitch, right? And so you don't want to rely on that it's this meets this kind of trick to do the work of your pitch for you. And I don't think you were doing that at all, but you just want to be careful not to do that. You want to be careful that that the this meets this is kind of like an enhancement, right? It doesn't, that you're still telling the story fully, your own story, right? And so that's really important when you do that. And I would say save that for the end, right? Like now I know what your story is. I know what the genre is. I've heard about the tone. I kind of know what you're doing. And then when you reference to, and usually they're hits, right? Because you're trying to sort of associate yourself with something that was successful. When you do that, then that kind of, this meets this kind of shipping of two things, it will resonate in the room. Even if people haven't seen the films, they'll kind of get a sense of what you're saying. So hopefully that was helpful, and I'm excited to see that movie. It's definitely a film I want to go see, so we have to figure out how to get it set up. And if you're at Anonymous Content, hopefully they're going to help you do that. So thank you, Kiana. Marcelo, do we want to go to our next pitch? Hey, Betty.
Hi, H. Hi, everybody.
How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Awesome. Really nice to meet you. Let's jump in so you have plenty of time.
Definitely. So I'm Betty. I was born in New York City, and I'm a former actor who now specializes in writing comedies about Asian American women fighting the overwhelming pressure to become too normal. So here's my pitch for my half-hour single-camera comedy, The Big 80s. War, hyperinflation, viruses, lockdowns, kind of makes you want to escape to another time period, doesn't it? A couple of years ago, I joined a Facebook group called Everything Was Better in the 1980s, and today this group has almost 50,000 members, and it keeps growing. So that got me thinking, if someone offered you the chance to live in the 1980s forever, would you accept? Frustrated by a stressful and increasingly negative world, Luna May Sun joins an alternative living community where nobody acknowledges life after 1989. The Big 80s ultimately asks this question: can a bright, independent woman who's a proud member of Generation X find happiness by returning to the decade of her youth, completely erasing her memory and detaching herself from 2020 and beyond? Or is Luna just setting herself up for failure, surrounding herself with a bunch of aging has-beens who won't let go of big hair and corny synth pop music? Join us in the Big 80s and find out.
That's really fun. That's great. That's great. I as a product of the 80s,
Yay!
I both am terrified and also won't look away. So I think what's really interesting, right, is you let us know right away there was a half-hour comedy. I think you said single camera, right? Half-hour single camera comedy. And then you started with war, famine, whatever it is.
Pestilence.
Right? Pestilence, disease, pestilence. I actually think maybe you don't want to take the air out of that by telling us it's a comedy up at the front, right? Like I saw your log line actually, coming into the pitch, and I was asking myself, like, okay, this sounds like a comedy, but it could also be a dystopic thriller, right? Because I didn't know your genre yet from your log line. And I kind of think it's kind of fun sometimes to when you walk in a room, your execs have seen a log line. They know you're pitching a half hour, single camera, but it's kind of effective sometimes to start in a place that they don't expect and then reveal the punchline, right? And obviously you were reading it here, but in the room when you're really dramatizing it, if you were like, okay, guys, this is a story about war, disease, pestilence, and a trip back to the 80s to avoid it all, right? Like you can kind of you can play the top of it in a comedy pitch like the joke, right? The setup and the punchline, and that could be a really fun way in. And I think more generally for everybody in the session, lead with a hook. Lead with a real kind of 1-2 punch, and that's not just for comedy, right? Comedy lends itself to that because you can do a setup and a payoff, but even if it's a dystopic thriller, right, you kind of want to have that first line or those first couple of lines be a real hook, a real way into your story, where then the execs kind of sit up and they want to hear the rest of it, which will be more detail, right, the sort of detail of the story. I think that it sounds like you have a very clear who and a very clear what. And your why is clear in terms of this person is just feeling too stressed about the way things are today. I might press a little more on the why and also the inciting incident, right? I think you kind of told it from your own perspective, Betty, that you were in this Facebook group that's about the 80s and it got you thinking, but you could almost do that from the protagonist's point of view, right? You could say, and forgive me, I can't remember your protagonist's name, but my protagonist is battling all the feelings that we're all battling every day about how rough this world is right now, and she took refuge in this 80s Facebook group, right? And she, is it a hot tub time machine moment or a Back to the Future moment? Like, does the computer drop in the bathtub and suddenly she's in the 80s? Like, whatever that inciting moment is, you probably want to include that in the comedy pitch, right? Like how she actually gets transported back to the 80s. And I think then that really brings the pitch to life when, everybody understands she was in the bathtub with a glass of rosé in her Facebook group and it all went into the bath water and now she's actually in the 80s, right? And that one's free. I'll just give you that one. And the other one, Betty, I'm sorry we got cut off. The other one I would say, and this session isn't really about actually getting into the nitty gritty of the stories as much as it is helping you shape what you already have. But I will just say this: it's interesting. You pitched it as a Gen X person going back to the 80s where they grew up. Another way to think about it that might be really interesting is if it's actually a millennial or somebody young from today's generation who's like, I got to get out of here. The 80s must have been better, right? And then they go back to the 80s and there's that dissonance of not having lived through it before, right? And you're encountering everything in the 80s for the first time. That obviously brings your audience age down, which studios love, right? Then suddenly you can have somebody much younger playing your protagonist and you can sort of have the comedy of that young person not getting it, right? Not getting the 80s. And when somebody says, oh, Reagan, what a monster. And the person from today is like, oh, really? Because I heard he was such a great guy, right? You could have some interesting moments around that. All right, so that is, I think, is that all of our pitches? I'm not sure. I know we had more folks that were queued up in terms of RSVPs. Marcelo, it looks like you're next. Do you want to chime in and tell me where we are?
Hello.
Marcelo, would you like to pitch your film or TV project?
Membership Maven makes good on video platform.
Membership Maven walks into a coffee shop. Runaway Bride Membership Maven. Exactly. How did we do? Do we have some more folks in the queue, or are we?
We've gone through the folks in the queue, and I think it went really, really great. I just want to let everyone know that we will be posting a recording of this to YouTube and linking that through to the app.
Before everybody goes, though, I'd love to just give you guys a few takeaways that I think are super helpful. Just in general, I know we got cut off with lots of people. So I just wanted to kind of do a little bit of recapping, which is that, I think you always want to answer the question, why do I care about this story, and why do I care about this protagonist, right? And that leads you to really think about stakes, right? What are the stakes of this story? Just remember, like, when you're watching a film or a TV show, you want people you care about in situations that are full of jeopardy, right? Even in a comedy, right? Full of jeopardy and full of sort of hurdles or stakes that they have to face and they have to get over, right? And that may be in your script, but you want to also make sure it's in your pitch, right? You always want to have that in your pitch. And make sure your first line is really great. It draws them in. That's what's going to make those execs pay attention. And your last line of the pitch should be great because that's what they're going to remember, right? You want to end on a great line, whether it's a cliffhanger or a joke or just a really great kind of takeaway moment that summarizes your story so that you can really leave the executives, A, wanting more, and B, remembering you, right? And I think the last thing I'll say is remember that you want to practice your pitch a lot, right? I mean, I can't even tell you when I would go and pitch a TV show how many times I would do that pitch over and over again. I was in a pitch for a game show once where I was there with LL Cool J, or as I call him, LL. And he was the nicest guy on the planet, and he stayed with us the whole day. We did like 15 back-to-back TV pitches with network executives, and he and I did this banter in the pitch. And we did it for like 8 hours straight, right? And at the end of it, he turned to me and he's like, "You're unbelievable because you actually managed to hit the same joke in every pitch, and the pitch at the end of the day was exactly as good and on point as the pitch at the beginning of the day." And what I didn't tell my friend LL is that it was because I had practiced it like 1,000 times in my bathroom mirror, right? It was way better when he was there with me, I have to admit. So just remember that, like, this stuff, and it does always change, right? As you revise your script, as you do notes, you're going to want to revise your pitch. You're going to want to reflect that. So, keep running it past people, keep practicing it, and keep trying to make it better, because that's your sales tool, right? That's your number one sales tool. Is once you get in the room, you wanna knock it out of the park. Happy to answer more questions. You guys can all DM me on HUSSLUP, and you can ask me any other questions. Happy to continue the conversation about all of these scripts. I thought that they were all great ideas with a lot of potential. And I hope this session really helped you craft a killer elevator pitch that helps you go out and sell these projects. I want to watch all of them. And we'll be doing more career development, and we'll be doing more creative workshops this summer. So do check in with the app, check in with your member email updates, and take a look for the other things that we'll be doing on Weight Room and in person. I hope all of you are going to make it to our member mixer this Sunday, June 5th. And we'll love to see you guys in person and continue these conversations over a cocktail. And in the meantime, let's hustle up.
Thank you.
That's it. That's all I got. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate it. Have a great day.